In the harsh winter of World War II, American troops follow orders from familiar voices, only to march straight into enemy hands. The officers giving those commands wore U.S. uniforms, but weren't American at all. What happens when the enemy looks exactly like you? December 16, 1944. In the cold stillness of Belgium's Ardennes forest, the sound of engines breaks the morning quiet. American convoys move along narrow, snow-dusted roads, unaware that they are driving straight into the largest German offensive of the Western Front. The Battle of the Bulge has begun. Within hours, reports start reaching division headquarters. Strange. Conflicting orders, convoys misdirected, bridges left unguarded. At first, it seems like ordinary confusion. Then the messages grow more alarming. Units swear they were guided by American soldiers who spoke perfect English, wore familiar uniforms, and carried genuine identification. Only later, when the traps close, do survivors realize those Americans were not Americans at all. The deception begins with small things. Road signs turned in the wrong direction. Military police giving false instructions. A supply truck diverted into enemy-held territory. Communications fail one by one. Every error appears accidental, until the pattern becomes impossible to ignore. In field reports and diary entries recovered after the battle, soldiers describe a new and disorienting fear. The enemy now wears their own face. One lieutenant wrote, "It wasn't the shells or the cold that frightened us most. It was the idea that the man next to you might not be who you thought he was." Across the front, rumor spreads faster than radio signals. At one checkpoint near Malmedy, military police detain a jeep carrying two supposed American officers. Their paperwork is flawless, their accents genuine. Only when a sentry notices a misplaced rank insignia does doubt turn to suspicion. Minutes later, interrogation confirms the unthinkable. They are German commandos in disguise. The revelation travels through the ranks like wildfire. By midday, paranoia takes hold. Every uniform becomes suspect. Soldiers begin testing each other with questions about baseball scores, movie stars, or small-town landmarks, anything an imposter might fail to answer. Some men pass easily. Others hesitate, and that hesitation alone is enough to trigger detention. Trust, once the glue of every unit, begins to crack. Behind this chaos lies months of planning. In October 1944, Hitler approved an audacious operation designed to sow confusion behind Allied lines. The concept was simple, yet psychologically devastating. Send English-speaking German troops dressed as Americans to infiltrate the front. Their task was not to fight pitched battles, but to fracture command structure, misdirect reinforcements, and erode confidence. It was warfare aimed directly at the human mind. The Ardennes was the perfect setting. Thick forests concealed movement, roads were few and easily manipulated, and overcast skies grounded Allied aircraft. For an operation built on deception, conditions could not have been better. As the German artillery barrage roared to life, the disguised units slipped through the confusion. They drove captured jeeps, carried American rifles, and spoke with practiced ease. Their first objectives were simple: reverse signposts, plant false demolition warnings, and cut communication cables. The results were immediate. Columns of American armor found themselves rerouted miles off course. Entire divisions reported conflicting orders, unsure which command posts still existed. At one crossroads near Stavelot, a group of engineers halted after being flagged down by men waving American helmets. The supposed MPs directed them to take an alternate route. Hours later, the engineers' convoy stumbled into German lines and was destroyed. Survivors recalled the disbelief of realizing their downfall came not from enemy fire, but from misplaced trust. By nightfall, confusion had become the Germans' most potent weapon. Radio operators reported messages in flawless English, giving contradictory coordinates. Bridges scheduled for demolition remained intact because someone posing as a U.S. officer countermanded the order. Supply depots were left exposed as trucks followed false directions. In one instance, an entire fuel column vanished into captured territory, its drivers convinced they were following standard procedure. The psychological toll on American troops was profound. Ordinary caution turned into obsession. Sentries began challenging every vehicle, every pedestrian. Passwords changed so often that even genuine messages were treated with suspicion. Division headquarters issued memoranda warning soldiers not to discuss operations with anyone they did not personally know. The sense of unity that had carried the Allied advance through France suddenly fractured under invisible pressure. Veterans later described it as a different kind of battle, one fought not for ground, but for certainty. When the enemy could appear in familiar colors, every decision required hesitation. And in war, hesitation costs lives. In the days that followed, American intelligence officers compiled fragments of intercepted reports and prisoner interrogations. They discovered that the infiltration was part of a larger scheme supporting the German counteroffensive toward the Meuse River. But in these first chaotic hours, no one knew its scale. What mattered was the immediate corrosive effect, suspicion spreading through the ranks like frost on glass. At the front, ordinary soldiers improvised their own tests of loyalty. Some asked who won the previous year's World Series. Others demanded to spell obscure town names or sing verses of popular songs. What began as a clever safeguard soon devolved into mass confusion. Men who failed the tests, often for trivial reasons, were detained, interrogated, sometimes even transferred to holding areas far from the line. Commanders struggled to separate fact from fear. The effect rippled upward. Field orders slowed as officers double-checked every signature. Communications that once flowed freely now required multiple confirmations. The pace of the German advance depended on surprise. The pace of the American response slowed under self-doubt. For a moment, the German deception appeared to be succeeding beyond expectation. But deception carries its own risk. Each captured imposter revealed more about the operation's methods. As American units adapted, they developed sharper questions and better procedures. Still, on that first day, the 16th of December, the balance tilted dangerously. The confusion bought the Germans precious hours, allowing armored divisions to surge deeper into Allied territory than anyone thought possible. For those who lived through it, the memory never faded. The Battle of the Bulge would be remembered as a struggle of endurance and courage, but also as a lesson in the fragility of trust. In December 1944, for a brief and harrowing time, American soldiers discovered that the most terrifying enemy was the one who looked exactly like themselves. The roots of this deception trace back to one man, Otto Skorzeny. By late 1944, his name was already legend inside the German High Command. Known for leading the daring mission that freed Benito Mussolini from Allied captivity the previous year, Skorzeny had earned a reputation as the Reich's master of unconventional warfare. He was tall, scar-faced, and ambitious, with an instinct for the dramatic. In an army built on tradition, he stood out as a soldier of ideas, dangerous, inventive, and willing to defy convention. In October 1944, when Germany's military situation had turned desperate, Adolf Hitler summoned Skorzeny to his private headquarters. The war on the Western Front was collapsing. The Allies had broken through in France and were pressing toward the German border. Hitler's generals proposed one last counteroffensive in the Ardennes, an attack designed to split the Allied lines and capture the vital port of Antwerp. But to succeed, they needed more than tanks and artillery. They needed confusion, something that could paralyze the enemy from within. The idea appealed to Skorzeny immediately, a deception so bold it would unsettle the entire American command structure. Hitler explained it in his own words: "We will turn their own weapons against them." The task was clear. Skorzeny would form a brigade of men who could pass as Americans, infiltrate behind Allied lines, and spread disarray at the critical opening of the offensive. The mission was codenamed Operation Greif, a word meaning griffin, a mythic creature both noble and predatory. From the start, the challenges were immense. The plan required soldiers fluent in English, familiar with American customs, and capable of imitating the casual confidence of a U.S. soldier. Few in the German army met that description. Skorzeny began searching among units that had previously served on the Western Front, combing through records for men who had lived or studied abroad. Notices went out across Germany, calling for volunteers with English-speaking ability. Responses came from unlikely sources: sailors, radio operators, and clerks who had once worked in British ports or American companies before the war. Some had emigrated families or had spent time overseas before 1939. Many spoke English with an accent, but Skorzeny believed determination could overcome imperfection. From thousands of names, fewer than 500 were selected for testing. Out of those, only a fraction proved competent enough to take part. Even within German command circles, the operation was controversial. Some officers called it dishonorable, arguing that wearing the enemy's uniform violated the laws of war. Others doubted its feasibility. Skorzeny dismissed their objections. To him, this was psychological warfare, a legitimate extension of strategy. He saw deception as a weapon of intellect, not treachery. His goal was not massacre, but confusion, not brute force, but manipulation. At the Grafenwöhr training area in Bavaria, his men began their transformation. The base became a strange imitation of an American camp. Captured jeeps and trucks were brought in for study. English-language manuals appeared on desks beside German field maps. Recruits practiced American gestures, slang, and even profanity, mimicking the relaxed confidence that defined U.S. soldiers. Instructors drilled them on small details: how Americans smoked their cigarettes, how they held their rifles, how they joked among themselves. Every movement mattered. The process was as much psychological as linguistic. These men were asked to think like their enemy. Skorzeny reminded them constantly that success depended on conviction. If you act like an American, he told them, you become one in their eyes. It was a test of identity as much as discipline. Some recruits embraced the challenge, finding a strange thrill in their double lives. Others felt uneasy, aware that capture meant certain execution as spies. For Skorzeny, the moral risk was secondary to strategic reward. His guiding principle was simple: deception could achieve what armies could not. He studied Allied propaganda techniques, analyzing how radio broadcasts and false rumors had influenced German morale. He understood that modern warfare extended beyond the battlefield. It reached into the mind. Operation Greif would be a field experiment in psychological disruption. His methods drew attention from the highest ranks. Senior officers visited Grafenwöhr to observe the training. They saw men in American uniforms practicing checkpoint inspections, road sign changes, and traffic redirection. They heard perfect English spoken across parade grounds. To outsiders, it must have looked absurd, Germans pretending to be Americans in the heart of Bavaria. But to Skorzeny, it was a glimpse of warfare's future. Among his staff, the operation's true objectives were kept secret. Even the commandos themselves knew little beyond their individual roles. Some were told they would seize key bridges over the Meuse River. Others were instructed to spread false orders or sabotage communication lines. Every man carried false identification papers bearing American names and serial numbers. Their stories were rehearsed repeatedly until memory became instinct. In private correspondence after the war, Skorzeny described the mission as a psychological storm cloaked in uniforms. His fascination with deception bordered on obsession. He collected American magazines and newspapers, studying their tone and humor. He understood that authenticity rested not in language alone, but in attitude, the relaxed assurance of soldiers who believed they were winning. To replicate that confidence inside a losing army required extraordinary mental discipline. By November 1944, his unit, officially designated as the 150th Panzer Brigade, was assembled, though still incomplete. Of the men chosen, fewer than 40 spoke English fluently enough to operate independently. The rest would provide logistical support or participate in conventional fighting once their disguises were no longer needed. The odds were steep, but Skorzeny accepted them. He was gambling on surprise, and surprise depended on daring. When Hitler reviewed the plan in early December, he was reportedly delighted. The Führer imagined that American forces would fall into total disarray. Bridges captured, orders confused, and commanders isolated. The Americans are young and careless, he told his staff. They will believe anything spoken in their own tongue. It was the language of overconfidence, yet Skorzeny shared some of that faith. He believed his operation could tilt the balance of the Western Front, even if only briefly. In reality, the resources were insufficient for such grand ambitions. Uniforms had to be scavenged from captured depots. American vehicles were repainted hastily. Many of the English-speaking volunteers struggled under pressure, reverting to German speech when startled. Yet the psychological potential remained immense. If even a handful succeeded in reaching the Allied rear, the confusion could disrupt the enemy for days. By December 10th, the 150th Panzer Brigade was ready. The men gathered near the Eifel region, awaiting final orders. In the frozen dawn, Skorzeny addressed them one last time. He told them they were about to wage a new kind of war, one fought not with bullets, but with illusion. For them, survival would depend not on strength, but on how well they could pretend. Within a week, they would step into the snow-covered forests of Belgium dressed as Americans. History would soon know their mission as Operation Greif, the most audacious deception of the war's final winter. In the final weeks before the Ardennes offensive, the men of Otto Skorzeny's Special Brigade faced a challenge unlike any other in the German army. Their mission was not simply to fight, it was to become their enemy. At the Grafenwohr training camp, rows of German soldiers marched in American boots, saluted like Americans, and carried themselves with unfamiliar looseness. Every day began the same way: language drills, mock interrogations, and lessons in American slang. English instructors, many of them former interpreters or merchants, corrected pronunciation until each word rolled off the tongue with convincing rhythm. The goal was not just fluency, but authenticity. Captured American field manuals became their textbooks. Soldiers studied the layout of U.S. rank insignia, the structure of divisions, and the look of identification tags. They memorized serial numbers, street names, and baseball statistics. Every detail mattered. A hesitation, a misplaced idiom, or an unfamiliar gesture could expose them. Some recruits carried notebooks filled with American expressions. Buddy, jeep ride, coffee break. They practiced small talk, rehearsing conversations that might never occur. Others learned the names of movie stars and popular songs, information useless in battle but essential for survival. To impersonate the enemy, they had to understand the American mind. Skorzeny's instructors drilled them in behavior. Americans, they explained, were informal, confident, sometimes irreverent toward authority. German discipline, rigid, precise, had to be unlearned. Soldiers were told to loosen their posture, to laugh more easily, to smoke without ceremony. One observer recalled watching an entire platoon practicing how to chew gum, a small act that somehow symbolized everything they were trying to imitate. The transformation was both physical and mental. German uniforms were replaced with American ones stripped from captured depots. Helmets bore the white star of the U.S. Army. Even cigarettes were changed. Lucky Strikes replaced homegrown brands. The men carried English newspapers, chocolate bars, and packs of chewing gum. Authenticity was a matter of survival. But beneath the rehearsed gestures lay unease. Wearing the enemy's colors was forbidden by international convention. Every man knew the punishment if captured: execution without trial. Some accepted the risk as a matter of duty. Others struggled with it. In letters later recovered, several soldiers wrote of their discomfort. One described the uniform as a borrowed skin. Another confessed that looking in the mirror made him feel like a stranger in his own body. Scorzeny understood these doubts, but pushed them aside. He reminded his men that deception was an old art in warfare. Ancient generals had used disguises, false flags, and misleading signals. To him, Operation Greif was simply the modern version of that same principle. If confusion can save lives, he told them, then confusion is a weapon worth using. The training grew more intense as December approached. Each soldier received a fabricated American identity. They memorized names, service numbers, and hometowns, fictional but realistic. Some were assigned to units that actually existed, while others posed as engineers, dispatch riders, or military police. The cover stories were designed to withstand interrogation for several minutes, long enough to complete their tasks. Intelligence officers provided captured maps and authentic paperwork. The men studied road networks, bridge coordinates, and Allied radio codes. They learned to recognize American uniforms at a glance, down to the placement of shoulder patches. To ensure realism, Scorzeny arranged for English-speaking prisoners of war to interact with the trainees. The prisoners were ordered to correct mistakes and teach idioms that only native speakers would know. Among the recruits, there were men who carried personal ties to the United States. One was the son of a baker from Milwaukee who had returned to Germany before the war. Another had worked in a New York shipping firm in the 1930s. Their memories became valuable resources, offering small but vital insights, the way Americans greeted each other, the rhythm of their sentences, the brands of coffee they preferred. These fragments of culture became the raw material of deception. The more they practiced, the more blurred the line between imitation and identity became. In one training exercise, an entire squad conducted a mock traffic stop in English so convincingly that even visiting officers hesitated to speak German. The illusion was complete, but the price was psychological strain. As one participant later recalled, it felt as though we were betraying both sides, our enemy by pretending to be him, and ourselves by pretending not to be. By early December, the men were divided into small teams. Each would operate independently once the offensive began. Some were assigned to seize bridges across the Meuse River, others to sabotage communications or spread false orders. Their main mission was disruption, not combat. Success depended on speed, subtlety, and nerve. Every man carried counterfeit papers, identification tags, and English-language passes. Many also carried cyanide capsules, a grim acknowledgement of what would happen if they were caught. Yet morale remained steady. Scorzeny's confidence was contagious. He told his officers that the fate of the entire offensive might hinge on their success. If they could delay Allied reinforcements by even a day, the German army might reach the Meuse before the enemy understood what was happening. In the final briefing, Scorzeny presented them with a simple truth: you are soldiers of deception. Victory will not come from strength, but from what they believe. His words became a quiet mantra among the men as they prepared to move out. On the eve of departure, the commandos tested their disguises in controlled exercises. They drove captured jeeps, set up fake checkpoints, and issued mock orders in English. Observers reported that many of them could no longer be distinguished from real Americans. The transformation was complete, at least on the surface, but beneath that calm exterior, anxiety ran deep. Some soldiers tucked small German tokens into their pockets: a coin, a photograph, a reminder of who they really were. Others avoided mirrors, unwilling to confront the face they now wore. For many, it was a psychological performance from which there was no return. On December 14, 1944, final orders arrived. The Ardennes offensive would begin in 2 days. The disguised commandos were loaded into trucks, their uniforms hidden under heavy coats. They would move with the first wave of the attack, slipping through the confusion that followed the artillery barrage. As the convoy rolled toward the front, few spoke. The air was heavy with expectation. Some watched the snow-covered landscape pass by and wondered how long their borrowed identities would last. Others rehearsed their cover stories one last time. By nightfall, they reached the edge of the forest. Engines idled in silence. Ahead, lay the American lines, and beyond them, uncertainty. The men of Operation Greif were about to cross the most dangerous boundary of the war, the boundary between truth and deception. December 16th, 1944. Before dawn, the stillness of the Ardennes is shattered by the roar of German artillery. Thousands of shells crash into American lines from Monschau to Luxembourg. The Battle of the Bulge has begun. Under the cover of the bombardment, Otto Skorzenny's disguised commandos, men dressed in American uniforms, move into position. Their mission? To confuse, mislead, and paralyze the Allied response before it can begin. In the half-light of early morning, convoys of jeeps painted with American markings roll through the forest roads. Their drivers speak English with convincing fluency. Military police armbands, captured maps, and American cigarettes complete the illusion. Behind them, German armored divisions advance, hidden by fog and deception. For the first time in the war, the front line itself becomes a mirage. The first hours of Operation Greif unfold with remarkable success. Near the town of Huningen, a team posing as American engineers redirects an entire supply column onto a side road. The convoy disappears into terrain now under German control. At another intersection, commandos posing as traffic police quietly reverse road signs, turning Bastogne toward the wrong direction. Within minutes, chaos spreads across miles of forest. By noon, American units begin reporting strange incidents. Bridges left undefended, messages received from unfamiliar voices, and vehicles with American markings appearing from the east. Command posts attempt to verify orders, but lines are jammed or cut entirely. The Germans' deception spreads faster than any artillery barrage. In a matter of hours, confusion becomes the most effective weapon on the battlefield. Skorzenny's strategy is simple. Weaponize trust. In war, soldiers depend on recognition, uniforms, symbols, and language to distinguish friend from foe. Operation Greif turns those very signs into instruments of doubt. The commandos issue false orders, misdirect convoys, and cut telephone wires. In one documented case, a disguised officer instructs American engineers to remove demolition charges from a bridge, claiming a friendly armored column will soon cross. Hours later, that bridge serves as a crossing point for German tanks. By the evening of December 16th, rumors sweep through the American ranks. Reports claim that German soldiers in U.S. uniforms are everywhere, at checkpoints, in command posts, even inside headquarters. In some sectors, American military police begin stopping every vehicle, demanding passwords and personal details. The questions become cultural tests. Who won the World Series last year? What's Mickey Mouse's girlfriend's name? Soldiers who hesitate face interrogation. The paranoia deepens. Near Spa, an entire American platoon is detained after one of its members fails to name the capital of Illinois. Genuine soldiers are being treated as suspects. The fear of imposters spreads like wildfire. Friendships forged in battle dissolve under suspicion. As one officer later recalled, "It wasn't the Germans we feared most that night. It was each other." Meanwhile, the German commandos press deeper behind the lines. Small teams, no more than 4 or 5 men, move swiftly through villages and crossroads, performing acts of sabotage and deception. Some cut power cables, others plant false minefield signs or drop counterfeit orders along the roads. Every act, no matter how small, adds another layer of uncertainty to the American defense. In one notable case near Stavelot, a disguised patrol successfully redirects an American tank column toward a non-existent supply point. The tanks spend hours navigating narrow forest roads, only to realize they have been moving in circles. By the time communication is restored, valuable daylight has been lost. Such delays, multiplied across the front, slow the Allied response to the German breakthrough. But success comes at a price. By December 17th, the Americans begin tightening security. Checkpoints multiply, identification procedures grow stricter, and anyone caught giving inconsistent answers faces immediate arrest. For the disguised Germans, movement becomes dangerous. Their own brilliance now threatens to expose them. At one checkpoint west of Malmedy, a jeep carrying 3 supposed American officers is halted. Their uniforms are perfect, their speech confident. But when asked about the location of the Brooklyn Dodgers' home field, one hesitates. Within minutes, the deception unravels. The men are searched, their papers examined, and German items are found in their pockets. They are immediately detained and later identified as part of Scorsini's unit. News of their capture confirms what had only been rumor. The enemy is among them. The psychological shock is profound. Soldiers begin questioning not only strangers, but familiar faces. Men who had fought side by side now exchange wary glances. The war of nerves intensifies. Reports circulate that German infiltrators plan to assassinate General Eisenhower. Security in Allied headquarters becomes extreme. Roads leading to command centers are sealed. Senior officers are stopped and questioned by their own guards. Even General Omar Bradley is briefly detained until his identity can be confirmed. For the Germans, this growing paranoia marks both success and danger. The confusion they have created fulfills the mission's purpose, but it also closes every road behind them. As the American system tightens, escape becomes nearly impossible. Teams operating deep behind enemy lines find themselves trapped between suspicion and encirclement. By the end of the second day, Scorsini's commandos are scattered across a landscape of fear. Some continue spreading false orders and misinformation. Others, cut off and unable to move, abandon their disguises and rejoin conventional units. A few are captured, often by men too frightened to take chances. Among those captured is a young German lieutenant, fluent in English, who had spent his childhood in Ohio before returning to Germany in 1938. His story becomes emblematic of Operation Greif's strange duality. Men fighting for one homeland while wearing the uniform of another. Interrogators note his calm demeanor, his fluent accent, and his quiet resignation. When asked why he participated, he replies simply that he was a soldier following orders. The infiltration has achieved what it set out to do: disrupt communications, delay reinforcements, and sow distrust. But the cost is high. Many of the disguised soldiers are executed as spies under the laws of war. Yet their impact lingers. For the Americans, the experience leaves a wound that will take months to heal. Every checkpoint, every question, every moment of hesitation becomes a reminder of how easily truth can be manipulated. As the Battle of the Bulge rages on, Scorsini receives fragmented reports. Some of his teams have vanished. Others claim to have turned entire convoys astray. The mission's tactical value remains uncertain, but its psychological effect is undeniable. An army that once trusted its own symbols now views them with suspicion. The Germans have achieved something new in modern warfare. Victory not through force, but through doubt. Operation Greif has entered its most dangerous phase. For the Americans, the front is no longer defined by geography but by perception. Every uniform, every voice, every friendly wave could be the mask of deception. And in that winter of 1944, on the snowbound roads of Belgium, war itself changes shape. By the third day of the Ardennes offensive, confusion had evolved into crisis. American command posts from Saint-Vith to Liège were receiving contradictory reports. Bridges captured, roads impassable, headquarters relocated without orders. Each message seemed genuine, yet each contradicted the next. No one could tell which reports came from real officers and which had been forged by German infiltrators. Inside the 12th Army Group headquarters, Lieutenant Colonel Edward Morrison, an intelligence officer known for his calm precision, faced an impossible task: restore order to an army that no longer trusted itself. Morrison had served since North Africa and had seen deception before: fake radio signals, counterfeit maps, but nothing like this. In the Ardennes, the enemy had stolen identity itself. Morrison began gathering evidence. Captured prisoners confirmed the existence of disguised German units operating in small groups. Some claimed their purpose was limited to sabotage. Others suggested more sinister objectives, capturing key bridges, assassinating Allied commanders, or spreading false orders to paralyze defenses. The information was fragmented but terrifyingly plausible. For Morrison, one truth was clear. Psychological warfare was no longer a theory. It was happening in real time. Orders were issued across the front. All units must verify identities of personnel, no matter rank or uniform. At every road junction and village, new checkpoints appeared overnight. Military police questioned every driver, searched every vehicle, and demanded personal details that only a true American might know. The questions varied by region and creativity. Some guards asked who won the World Series or who played for the Yankees. Others demanded to know the capital of a state, the name of a movie star, or the price of a pack of cigarettes. In the early hours of December 18th, a group of sentries near Spa stopped an entire convoy of medical trucks because one driver pronounced lieutenant in the British way, lieutenant. The measures were improvised and imperfect, but they reflected the Army's growing desperation. The infiltration had turned soldiers into detectives. For men already exhausted by combat, the new burden of constant suspicion felt heavier than the winter cold. Morrison's own reports describe a spreading tension at all levels of command. "No man feels safe from accusation," one entry reads. Even officers known for months are now viewed with doubt. The paranoia soon reached absurd extremes. Near Verviers, a brigadier general was detained after failing to identify the correct state for the city of Springfield. Another officer was forced to sing part of the national anthem before being released. Some divisions began issuing secret code questions. Answers changed daily to ensure security. But even that system faltered when passwords were forgotten or misheard under pressure. Across the battlefield, ordinary routines became obstacles. Supply convoys halted for hours at checkpoints. Radio messages went unanswered because no one could confirm the sender's identity. Artillery units delayed fire support while verifying coordinates. The efficiency that had characterized the Allied advance since Normandy began to crumble under self-inflicted hesitation. Morrison worked tirelessly to regain control. His intelligence teams compiled a list of captured German infiltrators, some fluent in English, others barely competent. Each interrogation revealed fragments of the plan. The training at Grafenwöhr, the use of American equipment, the instructions to spread chaos rather than fight directly. The information confirmed what he feared most. The enemy had exploited not weakness of force, but weakness of trust. Meanwhile, fear spread beyond the front lines. Rumors circulated that German commandos planned to infiltrate Allied headquarters in Paris, or even assassinate General Eisenhower himself. Security across the rear areas intensified dramatically. The Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, based in Reims, was transformed into a fortress of barriers, identity checks, and patrols. Eisenhower's movements were restricted. Even his personal drivers were replaced, vetted, and rechecked daily. For soldiers in the field, the paranoia was suffocating. Men began distrusting even their closest comrades. One veteran later recalled that everyone seemed to look twice at each other's faces, searching for hidden accents or strange habits. A simple hesitation could trigger suspicion. A wrong answer could end with a weapon raised. The psychological effect was devastating. Reports of mistaken arrests piled up. An American sergeant from Illinois spent 3 days under guard after failing to name the capital of New York. A private of Polish descent, whose English was imperfect, was nearly executed before an officer intervened. Even officers of long standing found themselves questioned by subordinates. The shared identity of the U.S. Army, so vital to its strength, had fractured into individual uncertainty. Despite these strains, Morrison and his staff began to adapt. They issued standardized security questions, reorganized checkpoint procedures, and established clearer communication between divisions. Gradually, order began to return. The infiltration threat remained, but it could now be contained. Intelligence summaries circulated to commanders included descriptions of German imposters, incorrect shoe patterns, unfamiliar vocabulary, and inconsistencies in equipment. Every detail, no matter how small, became a tool for survival. Yet the paranoia refused to fade. In some areas, units refused to accept replacements until they had been personally verified by senior officers. Patrols that once moved freely now hesitated at friendly positions. Even genuine orders were double-checked with neighboring units. The battlefield had become a maze of second-guessing. On December 19th, Morrison received word of several captured infiltrators near Malmedy. Interrogation revealed that their objectives were not large-scale sabotage, but confusion. They had switched road signs, issued false retreat orders, and misdirected reinforcements. None had attempted to attack directly. Their mission was mental disruption, and it had succeeded far beyond their numbers. But the cost to them was high. The captured men knew what awaited them. Military tribunals classified their actions as espionage, an offense punishable by death. Even as the trials proceeded swiftly, Morrison admitted a reluctant respect for them. "They were soldiers," he wrote in a private note, "fighting in a way we were not prepared for. They understood that fear itself could be a weapon." In the coming days, the first executions took place near Huy and Namur. News of these sentences spread quickly, serving both as warning and reassurance. For the Americans, it marked the moment when control began to return. The visible enemy was easier to face than the invisible one. Still, the damage could not be undone overnight. Entire regiments operated under heightened alert, questioning anyone whose behavior seemed unusual. Field reports from this period reveal the strain in stark language. Men are afraid to speak first. They look for signs of deception in every word. It was as if the front line had turned inward, soldiers fighting not just the Germans ahead, but the doubts inside their own ranks. By December's end, the worst of the infiltration threat had passed. The real battle, the physical one, raged on in the snow-covered forests, but the psychological one had already left its mark. Operation Greif had failed to achieve its strategic goals, yet it had accomplished something far more insidious. It had made an army question its own. Reflection. Lieutenant Colonel Morrison summarized the lesson in a memo dated January 2nd, 1945. In this campaign, the enemy taught us that the surest way to weaken an army is not to destroy its weapons, but to break its confidence. For a time, he succeeded. For the soldiers of the Ardennes, the war had entered a new dimension, one where uniforms and passwords mattered less than perception. Trust had become the rarest commodity on the battlefield. And in the frozen forests of Belgium, every handshake, every salute, every spoken word carried the weight of uncertainty. By the fifth day of the Ardennes offensive, the deception that had begun with quiet confidence was collapsing under its own weight. The same confusion that once favored the Germans now turned against them. American counterintelligence, led by Lieutenant Colonel Edward Morrison, was closing in. What began as rumor had become organized pursuit. The hunters and the hunted were now entangled in a race measured not in miles, but in truth and illusion. Morrison's intelligence teams, working out of a cold farmhouse near Spa, had assembled a growing archive of field reports and interrogation transcripts. Each captured infiltrator brought fragments of a larger picture, training details, mission objectives, and even names of fellow agents still operating behind the lines. Piece by piece, Morrison reconstructed the structure of Operation Greif. The pattern was unmistakable. These were not random saboteurs. They were highly trained soldiers selected for language ability, disguised as Americans to sow maximum confusion. Many had studied in the United States before the war. Others had learned English through films or radio. Their leader, Otto Skorzeny, had turned cultural familiarity into a weapon. For Morrison, it was both fascinating and disturbing. Here was a form of warfare built not on firepower, but on psychology, on the manipulation of perception itself. He knew that if such tactics succeeded, they could change the nature of future wars entirely. His goal now was not only to stop the infiltrators, but to understand how their minds had been reshaped for deception. The interrogations began cautiously. The first prisoners were tense and silent, aware of their fate. But as fatigue and cold set in, fragments of truth emerged. They described months of training in Bavaria, American jeeps painted in German depots, and lessons in American slang. Some admitted to studying baseball statistics to blend in. Others revealed how their instructors told them that confusion, not destruction, was their true mission. One prisoner, a 28-year-old named Gunther Schultz, stood out. Fluent in English, calm under questioning, he claimed to have grown up in Ohio before returning to Germany with his parents in 1938. His accent was nearly perfect. Even seasoned interrogators found it unnerving. His file described him as a man caught between two nations, yet loyal to neither. Morrison personally oversaw Schultz's questioning. Their exchanges were recorded in concise, factual notes. Schultz explained that he had been selected because of his time in America. He had once worked at a service station in Cleveland, where he learned to mimic the tone and habits of American GIs. When asked if he believed in the mission, he paused before answering. "I believed in survival," he said simply. "Ours and theirs," his words struck Morrison deeply. For all the intelligence reports and military files, nothing captured the psychological complexity of this operation better than that statement. These men were not fanatics. They were products of desperation. Soldiers, trained to wage a war of illusions at a time when Germany's defeat was already visible on the horizon. Morrison's respect for their ingenuity did not change the reality of their situation. Under the laws of war, wearing an enemy uniform in combat was considered espionage, a crime punishable by death. The Geneva Convention left no room for ambiguity. Still, he could not ignore the uneasy truth. These were soldiers acting under orders, caught between legality and loyalty. As the interrogations continued, Morrison's team discovered how far the deception had reached. Captured documents revealed that some infiltrators had managed to penetrate as far as the Meuse River before being caught. Others were still unaccounted for. Maps marked with reversed road signs and bridge coordinates confirmed how the commandos had manipulated movement during the battle's first chaotic days. The damage they caused was psychological, but it had real tactical effects. Delayed reinforcements, misdirected units, and hesitation at critical moments. By December 24th, Morrison's network of checkpoints and informants had tightened across the Ardennes. Reports of captured infiltrators multiplied. Some were caught because of a single misplaced German phrase. Others were betrayed by their boots, which lacked American tread patterns. A few surrendered voluntarily when surrounded, too exhausted to maintain the illusion any longer. That same day, a major commando team was captured near Malmedy after trying to pass through an American supply checkpoint. Their vehicle carried authentic papers, but one of the soldiers mistakenly addressed a guard as Herr. Within minutes, their cover collapsed. Documents found on them confirmed direct links to Skorzeni's command. Their trial was swift. A military tribunal convened in a makeshift tent, its purpose clear: to send a message. The accused were given translators, questioned briefly, and sentenced to death. The executions took place before Christmas. The official record described them as lawful punishment for espionage, but even among American officers, the atmosphere was uneasy. Some viewed it as justice. Others, including Morrison, saw it as the grim cost of psychological warfare. He wrote in his private report, "They fought with deception, but they fought as soldiers. To punish them as criminals is legally sound, yet morally uncertain." The comment was later redacted from the official transcript, but his words captured the ethical dilemma that would haunt military strategists for decades. Meanwhile, the Germans' plan continued to unravel. Those few commandos still at large found themselves hunted by patrols, betrayed by the very fear they had created. American soldiers, now alert to the threat, examined every uniform detail, the stitching on jackets, the brand of cigarettes, even the way men laced their boots. The slightest inconsistency could be fatal. Some infiltrators attempted to flee east, discarding their disguises and rejoining regular units. Others simply disappeared in the confusion, their fates unknown. For the Americans, the tide was turning. The deception that had once shattered trust was now contained through discipline and vigilance. Yet the deeper lessons were only beginning to emerge. Morrison realized that the Germans had not merely tested Allied security, they had exposed the fragile nature of human perception in war. An army could defend against tanks and artillery, but not against doubt. Once uncertainty entered the ranks, it spread invisibly, undermining unity from within. In late December, Morrison compiled his final intelligence summary on Operation Greif. It detailed how German planners had intended to seize key bridges and exploit Allied reliance on road networks. The report concluded that while the operation had failed militarily, it had achieved temporary but profound psychological disruption across multiple commands. He added a final note in the margin. The enemy understood that confusion is contagious. When news of Skorzény's name reached Allied intelligence, he became a symbol of the operation's audacity. American soldiers began calling him the most dangerous man in Europe. Rumors spread that he was planning new infiltrations, even assassinations. None of these proved true, but the fear itself became part of his legend. The hunter had become a phantom in the minds of his pursuers. By Christmas Eve, the snow-covered hills of the Ardennes were silent again, broken only by scattered gunfire. Most of Skorzény's men were dead or captured. Operation Greif had reached its inevitable end. But for Morrison, the investigation left more questions than answers about ethics, deception, and the human cost of psychological war. In a letter home written weeks later, he summarized it in one line. "We learned that truth is the first casualty of war, and once it dies, every man becomes a suspect." By December 22, 1944, the deception that had begun with precision was breaking apart under pressure. Operation Greif, the daring infiltration designed to paralyze the Allied response, was unraveling faster than its architect, Otto Skorzeny, could react. The fog of war that once concealed his commandos now worked against them. Checkpoints tightened. Roadblocks multiplied. Every vehicle in uniform was scrutinized. What began as controlled illusion had become a desperate fight for survival. The Battle of the Bulge was still raging. German forces had achieved temporary breakthroughs, driving deep into Belgium. Yet their advance slowed as American resistance stiffened. Fuel shortages crippled German armor, and the surprise that once favored them was fading. The psychological chaos created by Operation Greif had done its job, but only briefly. Now it was consuming itself. Skorzeny received conflicting reports from the front. Some of his disguised teams had succeeded in diverting convoys and cutting communications during the first 48 hours. Others had vanished entirely. He knew many had been captured. Interrogations by American intelligence were exposing the operation's structure. Soon, every checkpoint in the Allied zone would be on alert for imposters. At his forward command post near the Eifel region, Skorzeny reviewed what little information remained. He realized that the operation had reached its limit. Continuing the infiltration risked disaster. Even his best-trained men could no longer pass inspection under the tightening Allied system. American soldiers were now experts at spotting the smallest details: boots, helmets, vocabulary, even the way cigarettes were held. The disguise that once deceived now betrayed them. The mission's original objectives, to capture bridges over the Meuse River and enable the German advance, were now impossible. The Allied front, though shaken, had not broken. Reinforcements were arriving faster than anticipated. Snow and congestion slowed German columns. What had begun as Hitler's last gamble for victory was already showing signs of collapse. Skorzeny adapted quickly. Abandoning further infiltration, he reorganized the remaining men of the 150th Panzer Brigade into conventional combat units. They discarded their American uniforms, repainted vehicles with German markings, and prepared to fight as ordinary soldiers. For the first time since the operation began, deception gave way to open confrontation. The transition was chaotic. Many of the commandos were still scattered across the Ardennes, cut off from communication. Some continued their sabotage missions, unaware that the plan had been cancelled. Others discarded their disguises and surrendered, exhausted and out of supplies. A few managed to slip back through the lines, returning to German territory under cover of night. For them, the war would continue, but the illusion was over. American intelligence reported similar disarray. Lieutenant Colonel Edward Morrison's teams intercepted messages suggesting that Skorzeny himself was now commanding conventional armored engagements near Malmedy. His presence on the battlefield, no longer as a phantom of deception but as a field commander, symbolized the operation's transformation from psychological warfare to survival. In the Allied press, the story of the infiltrators spread rapidly. Newspapers printed sensational accounts of German soldiers disguised as Americans, heightening public fascination and fear. Civilians in liberated areas began scrutinizing soldiers passing through their towns, wary of accents and mannerisms. Operation Greif had failed militarily, but its psychological aftershock continued to ripple far beyond the battlefield. Behind closed doors, Allied commanders analyzed what had gone wrong for the Germans. The conclusions were clear. The operation had suffered from insufficient numbers, limited English proficiency, and unrealistic objectives. Many commandos were betrayed by simple mistakes, using German cigarettes, mispronouncing slang, or wearing equipment inconsistent with their supposed rank. Even the captured vehicles, once considered assets, became liabilities when fuel shortages forced their abandonment. Yet, despite its collapse, Operation Greif demonstrated something extraordinary: the power of perception as a weapon. In just a few days, a few dozen men had managed to disrupt entire divisions, forcing the U.S. Army to question itself. Generals were detained by their own guards. Orders were delayed. Reinforcements were misdirected. The effect could not be measured in territory gained, but in hours lost, and in the erosion of confidence. For the Germans, that brief advantage was not enough. By Christmas, the Allied counterattack was underway. Air superiority returned as skies cleared. American bombers struck supply lines, while infantry divisions regrouped. Skorzeny's brigade, now fighting openly, suffered heavy losses near La Glaise and Celle. The remnants withdrew eastward, leaving behind wrecked vehicles, burnt-out jeeps, and discarded American uniforms frozen in the snow. Hitler's vision of a miracle counteroffensive was disintegrating. The Meuse bridges remained firmly in Allied hands. The German advance stalled, then retreated. Operation Greif, once hailed as a bold innovation, became a footnote in a larger failure. Inside the German High Command, blame circulated quickly. Some officers accused Skorzeny of misusing resources that could have reinforced the main front. Others, however, admired his creativity. Even his critics acknowledged that the plan had been audacious, perhaps too audacious for an army already stretched to breaking. Skorzeny himself defended the operation as a necessary experiment. It proved, he later said, that imagination could be as dangerous as artillery. For the Americans, the aftermath brought mixed emotions. Relief that the infiltration was over, blended with lingering suspicion. Checkpoints remained in place long after the immediate threat had passed. Soldiers continued testing each other with cultural questions, long after it was unnecessary. The mental scars of the deception would outlast the battle itself. In Allied intelligence reports compiled in early January 1945, Morrison noted that the psychological consequences persisted even after the operation's tactical end. His analysis read, "The enemy failed to achieve his strategic aims, but succeeded in temporarily destabilizing command confidence. The long-term impact on field trust remains significant." It was an understated conclusion, for what had been one of the most unsettling episodes of the war. By early January, the tide of battle had turned decisively. The German offensive collapsed. What remained of Skorzeny's 150th Brigade retreated toward the Rhine, leaving behind prisoners and a legacy of moral ambiguity. Operation Greif was over. Its men, once invisible among their enemies, now stood in plain view as captives. Some of the captured commandos were executed as spies. Others were sent to prisoner-of-war camps. Their stories would resurface years later during post-war trials, sparking debates about legality and ethics. Were they soldiers or saboteurs? Warriors or deceivers? The answer depended on perspective. For the Americans who faced them, the operation was a chilling reminder of how thin the line between truth and illusion could become. For the Germans who carried it out, it was proof that courage and desperation could coexist within the same act. By the winter's end, the snow-covered roads of the Ardennes bore silent witness to both the chaos of deception and the cost of its failure. Operation Greif had promised Germany a strategic miracle. Instead, it delivered a psychological echo that would haunt both sides long after the shooting stopped. When the guns fell silent over the Ardennes, the echoes of deception did not fade. Operation Greif had ended, but its moral and psychological consequences were only beginning. In the first weeks of 1945, American investigators compiled detailed reports on the captured German commandos. 18 of them, those caught wearing U.S. uniforms during active operations, were sentenced to death as spies. The executions took place quickly and quietly, following military tribunals held near Huy and Liège. Each case followed the same pattern: confirmation of disguise, summary judgment, final sentence. The rules of war left little room for mercy. Others were taken as prisoners of war. They admitted their roles but insisted they had followed direct orders. Most were young, men who had believed the mission would help shorten the war or protect German lives. For them, the deception had never been an act of malice, but of duty. Otto Skorzeny himself was captured in May 1945 and brought to trial at Nuremberg. The charges centered on Operation Greif, specifically the use of enemy uniforms in combat. The tribunal examined evidence, testimonies, and the blurred distinction between lawful ruse and unlawful disguise. American officers, including Lieutenant Colonel Edward Morrison, testified to the facts, but also acknowledged the gray areas. The court ultimately ruled that wearing enemy uniforms for infiltration was illegal, but that Skorzeny's men had not actually engaged in combat while disguised. He was acquitted. The verdict stunned many, but reflected a deeper understanding of modern warfare's evolving boundaries. The trial set a precedent that still influences military law today. Deception is permitted in war, but perfidy, fighting in disguise, is not. In post-war Germany, the story of Operation Greif was told with a strange mixture of pride and regret. Some saw it as an example of ingenuity in the face of hopeless odds. Others viewed it as a futile gesture that cost lives for no gain. For Skorzeny, it became part of his legend, proof of his reputation as Hitler's master of special missions. But history would judge it differently. Strategically, the operation had failed. The Meuse bridges remained intact, the American lines held, and the war in Europe soon drew to a close. Yet psychologically, its influence endured. Military historians recognized Operation Greif as an early demonstration of information warfare, a campaign that targeted trust rather than territory. In the United States, veterans of the Battle of the Bulge carried the memory for years. Many spoke of how the infiltration had changed the way they viewed their comrades. Suspicion had become habit. Soldiers who once shared cigarettes in foxholes now asked each other questions before sharing food or information. The enemy had planted doubt, and that doubt survived long after the uniforms were folded away. Morrison's final post-war report summarized the lessons in measured words. The enemy failed to win ground, but succeeded in proving that confidence is the most fragile element in war. Once lost, it cannot be recovered through strength alone. For both sides, the reckoning was not only legal or tactical, but human. The commandos who survived captivity returned to a divided Germany. A few emigrated after release, some, ironically, to the United States, where they built quiet lives far removed from the deception they once lived. The men who had once pretended to be Americans eventually became Americans for real. History has no harsher irony. Operation Greif remains a reminder that victory in war is not measured only by battles won or lost, but by the cost paid in truth and trust. When soldiers can no longer recognize their own side, the war has already crossed a moral frontier from which there is no easy return. The Battle of the Bulge ended in victory, but the soldiers who fought it carried something home that could not be seen on any battlefield report. They had faced not just an enemy army, but an enemy wearing their own uniform. And long after the snow melted from the Ardennes, the doubt remained. In interviews and medical reports collected after the war, American veterans spoke about an unease that lingered for months, sometimes years. They remembered the checkpoints, the endless questions, the looks of suspicion among friends. One veteran described it as a war that turned inward, where the mind became another front. Line: psychologists studying combat stress after 1945 noted an unusual pattern among units that had been exposed to infiltration. Their soldiers showed higher rates of anxiety and mistrust even after returning home. Some found themselves checking identification badges in civilian life, an unconscious echo of those tense winter days in Belgium. The deception had ended, but the instinct to question never fully disappeared. For the U.S. Army, Operation Greif became a case study in psychological vulnerability. The enemy had demonstrated that confusion could spread faster than gunfire. Military schools later examined the episode as proof that morale could collapse not through defeat, but through disbelief. Officers who had served under Morrison's command described it simply, "We learned that truth could be attacked like a supply line." The human side of that lesson was painful. Many soldiers struggled to rebuild camaraderie. In the months following the battle, reports circulated of men refusing orders until identities were verified, even during non-combat duties. Trust, once the foundation of discipline, had to be reconstructed piece by piece. For some, the suspicion never left. Veterans spoke of scanning faces in crowds, listening for accents, or double-checking familiar names. The infiltration had been small in scale, yet its psychological shadow was immense. It had proved that an enemy could destroy confidence without firing a single shot. The U.S. War Department quietly commissioned studies on identity disruption in combat conditions. These reports concluded that uncertainty was one of the most effective forms of warfare and one of the hardest to counter. The experience in the Ardennes became a reference point for Cold War training programs focused on misinformation, espionage, and counterintelligence. Operation Greif, though militarily insignificant, helped shape the doctrines that would define the next generation of conflict. In Germany, surviving commandos offered their own reflections. Some expressed pride in having served in what they saw as an innovative mission. Others admitted to years of guilt, haunted by the realization that they had turned trust itself into a target. One former commando wrote in his memoir, "We changed clothes, but we also changed something inside ourselves. Afterward, I could not tell which uniform felt real." The psychological scars extended beyond the individuals. For many Americans, Operation Greif symbolized the dark evolution of modern warfare, a reminder that the mind could be attacked as easily as the body. The battlefield was no longer defined by front lines, but by perception. By the time peace returned to Europe, both sides understood the same truth. Deception leaves a mark deeper than defeat. It unsettles memory, reshapes loyalty, and lingers in silence long after the last battle ends. Lieutenant Colonel Morrison, in a private letter written in 1946, captured it best. "We rebuilt bridges, we buried our dead, but we never rebuilt trust in quite the same way. That winter taught us that the enemy outside is easier to face than the one that hides in doubt." Operation Greif ended on frozen roads in 1944, but its impact reached far beyond the Ardennes. It became a warning carved into military memory, that in the war for truth, victory is never final, and deception never fully dies.